as we talk, we have in this room the expert Matt Edwards, Director of Office of Russia, Ukraine and Eurasia, U.S. Department of Commerce, Trade Administration. That would be probably the most complicated position, I would say, probably in entire Washington, D.C. today. You have to be compensated, Matt, probably with extra effort on dealing and swimming between all those, what's happening in Washington, D.C. And we have in a folder in front of you, thank you for checking each our PowerPoint presentation, information that attached to you. We also have one of this sheet of paper on the trade statistic between Minnesota and Russia and some Russian kind of local history that you would make to see. And with this, Matt, let's welcome you to the podium. Thank you.
What am I hitting here?
Yeah, you're hitting this key.
Okay, that'll move me up. Great. All right. Well, thank you, Nikolai. Thanks to the Minnesota Trade Office for the chance I have to meet you and get to know your companies a little bit. I think the seminar is timely because whether your company or your client has been exporting to Russia for many years, or whether you're new to the market, there have been a number of changes to the business environment in country, as well as to the legal and regulatory requirements that apply to American companies. How many of your companies or your clients' companies are doing business in Russia right now? Okay, so it's probably about 60% of the room. Presumably the rest of you are maybe contemplating possible business, or you're on the lookout for what you might tell some clients who might in the future be doing business there. I appreciate that it's often quite difficult to get up-to-date information from various press reports that you might see regarding the business environment. Nikolai's example of information online that is misconstrued as suggesting that there are sanctions on Ukraine. That's an example of it. I want to offer some focused and practical thoughts on the Russian market, on what kinds of things you as American companies might or might not be allowed to do, and where you can go for more precise information that's applicable to your specific line of business. As a government official, I do have to offer some disclaimers. First, I'm here, I'm a civil servant, I'm not a political appointee, so I'm not here as a spokesperson for the administration on broader questions of U.S. policy toward Russia, and I'm not, I don't particularly want to speculate very much on what either Congress or the executive branch might decide for the future. Instead, I want to focus on current facts of the business situation as it is now, and the considerations facing your companies to help you assess what kind of business you might or might not be able to compete for, or at least preserve in the current environment. Since there is so much interest in sanctions, I'm going to talk a little bit about what you might need to do to plan or step up your due diligence, or possibly even refrain from certain potential business. A final disclaimer I'll offer is I'm not an attorney, and so I'm not in position to offer your company legal opinions. But if you do have a specific question about whether a certain type of export transaction or investment or a certain potential customer is likely to put your firm at risk, I can give you some general guidance, and I'll be happy to work with you one-on-one afterwards and point you towards some more authoritative sources. Let me start by addressing just some elementary questions that we sometimes get. A lot of companies want to know, can they still do business in Russia? Can they still serve customers there? And the short answer is yes, absolutely. U.S. companies can legally do business in sectors of the Russian economy that aren't under sanction, or with end users who aren't sanctioned. Russia is, it's a very important market still. It's by far the largest market in the post-Soviet space. About 2/3, 70% of the business that American companies do in the post-Soviet region is still with Russia. It's the world's 11th largest economy by nominal GDP, and if you look at that from a purchasing power basis, it's actually up as high as 6th right now. And even under sanctions and counter-sanctions, as you saw from Nikolai's charts, Russia purchased close to $6 billion from the U.S. last year in non-sanctioned goods, and that business, that figure of $6 billion doesn't include any trade and services, and it included almost no agricultural products, which usually account for anywhere between 15 and 25% of what we sell to any given foreign country. And going a little bit past the 2016 data that Nikolai showed, American exports to Russia, interestingly, were up 14% from last year through the first 2 quarters. That's the most recent figures we have available. Most of our larger corporations that work in the post-Soviet region manage their regional operations from headquarters in Moscow. So, I'm not here to tell you that you should or shouldn't seek business with any particular market. You'll want to look at the market for your particular products or your service and assess the pros and cons for yourself. Although the Russian economy is smaller than its peak of a few years ago, as I said, still a very large current market and potentially a much larger future market. It certainly makes sense that U.S. companies that are internationally minded and looking to expand overseas would consider doing so in Russia. Chances are that your foreign competitors are doing so. Most of your foreign competitors, their countries do not have the same level of sanctions that discourage our companies from doing business in Russia. So this is something it's a concern of ours from the standpoint of having a level playing field. On the other hand, Russia is a heavily regulated economy, and the operating environment for all companies there has gotten more complex, not only because of sanctions, but also because of a longer-term trend toward import substitution as official government policy over there. So, as you assess it, I think short-term our companies are not going to be able to do all they could in Russia in a non-sanctioned environment where we had a better bilateral relationship. But long-term, I think it is a market that really is too important to cede it to the Germans or the Chinese or whoever. On the positive side, Russia's economy has stabilized pretty substantially since 2015. The ruble's been more or less stable, although it's down to about half of its value of 4 years ago. It's been holding pretty steady around 55, 60 for the last couple of years. The Russian economy has been recovering. It's been growing, even if not rapidly, and they've achieved this growth despite a relatively weak energy price and commodity price environment. Just this past Thursday, I think Fitch has upgraded the sovereign credit outlook for Russia to positive, and I think that reflects upon sound fiscal management, sound monetary policy. Even if you can argue that maybe they haven't spent the money as well as they should have, the amount that they're spending has been very reasonable in line with their budget and their revenue intake. I think you all know they've got a massive natural resource base that ensures them a steady supply of revenues into the economy, even if those revenues fluctuate from year to year. Russia has, as you see there, they've got concentrated pockets of pretty well-educated middle-class consumers in many big cities. It's not an overcrowded market for many product categories, and so there still is headroom for new entrants. Sometimes in some sectors we find Russian government policy can even help improve a market, an import market, and I'll cite food processing as an example. Russia, for years, has been trying to modernize its agricultural sector and move up the value chain. And with the counter-sanctions that they imposed on European and American food products in 2014, that export market for our companies pretty much went away. However, on the food processing side, the quality equipment and technology that the Russians are looking for is just not readily available from domestic companies, and that's an area where their drive to bolster that sector has created more sales opportunities for our companies. Similarly, medical and scientific equipment, I know that's a major contributor to the Minnesota economy. The Russian health system is still in significant need of innovative materials and technologies. And although there are some procurement restrictions that require first consideration be given to domestic products, there are a lot of instances where there's just no comparable domestic analog available. Same is true of pharmaceuticals. We've also continued to do a very robust business in the civilian side of the aviation industry, not only in finished aircraft, but engines, avionics, various components. On the, I guess more on the negative side of the balance sheet, some developments we see in Russia are that the role of state-owned companies has been growing. They account for a significantly greater share of the economy than they did 5 or 10 years ago. You still have the probability, or at least the possibility, of political interference from Russian authorities at various levels. That varies from industry to industry and from location to location, but it's not zero. There are a number of policy changes that Russia could do to stimulate faster growth in the economy. They could go back to privatizing large enterprises. There's a lot they could do to deregulate the economy, just get rid of the red tape, the permits, and the certifications that they require. They could lift the caps that they have on foreign investment in certain sectors. They could promote greater competitiveness in industries that are currently dominated by one or a few large companies. However, all these policy changes that are sitting there on the table and by which they could improve their economy, most observers, I'm one of them, think that those changes are unlikely to happen, certainly between now and next March when Russia has its next presidential election, but quite possibly those changes could be put off for many years beyond that. And finally, as I mentioned, there's a long-term trend in Russia toward import substitution as an official Russian government policy. That takes several forms, ranging from tax credits or preferential financing from government banks for local companies to either soft or hard guidelines to limit purchases of foreign products, official so-called buy Russian preferences in government procurement. So that's domestically. Internationally, of course, as Nikolai mentioned, we have ongoing fallout from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. International sanctions are the most obvious impact of that. They remain in place. The trend has been one of gradual expansion of those sanctions. Not only the U.S., but also the European Union applies sanctions. And it's not been just in one direction either. Starting from August 2014, Russia imposed counter-sanctions against the agriculture sectors of the U.S., European Union, as well as Canada, New Zealand, Australia, some of the other countries that are sanctioning Russia. So as a result of this, you see limits on the willingness of Western banks to provide capital, particularly to some of Russia's largest enterprises or sectors. You see Russia's government, in some respects, doubling down on their reliance on state-owned companies rather than moving away from it. You see them doubling down on the policy of import substitution and trying to encourage domestic production, even where that production might be less efficient. And, there are, when I say lower velocity of new relationships, I just mean that there are fewer of these relationships being formed, and those that are being formed are taking longer to develop because of the due diligence that people have to do. I want to talk a bit about sanctions because I think just in terms from a legal standpoint, that's something that companies are most concerned about, and I understand quite a few of you are interested in that. As I said, our U.S. and European sanctions have been in place starting from March 2014 in response to Russia's seizure of Crimea, and they've been expanded in response to further interference in eastern Ukraine. There are three basic types of sanctions that the U.S. maintains. You'll hear some of these, as you research it, you'll hear some of these terms thrown out, and so I'll just cover what those are because it's a little bit esoteric. So you'll hear about SDNs, which are specially designated nationals. That just means a sanction that targets either specific individuals, or it can be a specific entity or a company. You'll hear about SSI. That simply means, it stands for Sectoral Sanctions Identification, and it simply means that we've got sanctions against business in a particular industry sector. And then finally, you have territorial sanctions, which apply comprehensively across both individuals and entities that are in a certain region or territory. And so in the case of Russia, we currently have a mix of all three. We've got sanctions that target individuals and entities who are based in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. We have sanctions that target so-called cronies of the Russian leadership. That simply means, that refers to business people who are seen as being close to President Putin or members of his administration. Sanctions that target people who are perceived or known to have benefited from some of the Russian government's actions in Crimea or eastern Ukraine. We've got sectoral sanctions, which affect business in oil and gas, defense technologies, and financial services quite broadly. And then finally, we have a set of sanctions that target individuals who are believed to have been involved in malicious cyber activity toward the U.S. A word about the importance of complying with sanctions. Of course, it's following the law. It's the right thing to do. But to put it more starkly, there can be consequences for not complying for your companies. The maximum penalty for violating sanctions can be as high as 30 years in prison. There are criminal fines that can range as high as $10 million. There can also be civil penalties of up to $1 million for each violation. I'm not an attorney, but I know that sanctions are treated under the principle of strict liability, which I'm told means that you or your company can be held accountable even if you didn't know you were violating the law and didn't intend to violate it. Further in that vein, a company can be held liable for the actions of one of its employees when it comes to sanctions evasion. Finally, just to make compliance a little more challenging, there's something called the 50% rule that applies. Basically, it means that if an entity, such as a corporate subsidiary, is owned 50% or more by either a sanctioned entity or a sanctioned individual, then the owned entity is also subject to sanctions. And if you have multiple owners and none of them has a 50% stake, but together they might have a 50% stake, then again the entity is considered sanctioned. So the fact that you have these overlapping kinds of sanctions means that you have to do more work to make sure your business is in the clear. You can't just count on the fact that, well, I'm not doing business in oil and gas, or I'm not doing business in the defense sector. That doesn't necessarily mean you're in the clear. So bottom line, it's very important to find out with whom you're dealing. These are some questions that I think you or your clients should be asking. Maybe the most important slide of my set here from that standpoint. Who in Russia is buying your products? Where in Russia are they located? If they happen to be in occupied Crimea, they might not necessarily advertise that when they're giving you their address. Who and where are the final or end user? Your customer might be an intermediary. Is your customer in a non-sanctioned sector but maybe intending to move your product to an end user who is in a sanctioned sector? In cases of corporate entities, who owns your customer? Is it a sanctioned individual? Is your customer owned either in whole or in part by another company that's sanctioned? If so, what is the share of that ownership? Another question, who are the individuals with whom you're interacting? You could have instances, and we've seen them, where a company is not sanctioned, but that company may have sanctioned individuals working for it. And you probably don't want to have one of those sanctioned individuals signing your contract. Finally, when do you check these things? Do you check them when you first assess a business proposal that you've gotten? Do you check them when you sign a contract? When you accept a payment? If it's a long-standing business relationship, do you check it when you amend or renew a contract? What happens if your customer gets sold or acquired? You want to continue doing business with them, but their ownership has changed. I would submit that any of those instances is an occasion for a check. And I think it's important for companies to have clear accountability. Do you have somebody in your company, or does your client have somebody in that company who is clearly designated as being responsible for checking these questions? And then once you've checked all those, did the sanctions themselves change since you last checked? There have been a number of updates to U.S. sanctions. Again, as I said, most of them have been in place since September of 2014. However, there have been a number of minor modifications since then. Most of those modifications have involved making some additional entities or persons subject to sanctions. There have been a couple of them which have actually simply clarified or in some cases even limited the scope of earlier sanctions. But for the most part, they have, they've gradually expanded, so you do need to keep up with them. Those are the dates of some of the FR notices that you can check in order to make sure you're up to date on what the regulations are. And then finally, what's really new, in addition to all of the previous sanctions which were established by the executive branch under executive orders, the scope of U.S. sanctions was expanded or potentially expanded by the legislation that, as Nikolai mentioned, was passed by Congress in July and signed by the President in August. That's it's called the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or you'll hear it with the acronym CATSA, and I think you'll hear more about it in the days and weeks ahead. That law reaffirms all of the previous sanctions that we talked about that were under executive orders targeting energy, defense, finance, and certain individuals. But the law goes further by codifying them, meaning that they cannot be lifted simply at discretion of the president, either the current president or subsequent presidents, as long as the law is on the books. So it would literally require an act of Congress to change that legislation. Besides codifying the previous sanctions, the law also provides for the possibility of additional sanctions on Russian companies that are involved in certain transactions with the Russian defense or intelligence sectors, companies that are involved with certain Russian energy export pipelines. It imposes tighter restrictions on equity or debt financing for the banking and energy sectors. It provides for at least the possibility of the expansion of sanctions into the rail, the metal, and the mining sectors. And we're in a particularly tricky period right now because some parts of the law give the executive branch 60 days to assess whether additional entities might be subject to sanctions. There are other parts of the law which call for guidance to be issued in 90 days. Other guidance, there are other provisions that call for decisions to be made within 180 days. We are, since the law was signed on August 2nd, we're still in all of those periods right now, and the executive branch agencies that are responsible for developing this guidance, primarily the State Department and the Treasury Department, are still working on it. And so we are in a period where there's a lot of unclarity about exactly what this new legislation is going to mean. Understandably, that creates some potential uncertainties for you or your clients if you're selling or wanting to sell to Russian customers who might fall in one of the areas that I just mentioned. There are two offices with whom you should consult if you think there's a chance that either current business or future business that you're contemplating could be affected by sanctions. The Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Asset Control and the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security. The Office of Foreign Asset Control, or OFAC, administers economic and trade sanctions broadly. And so that includes investment, it includes purchases of equity if you're buying into Russian companies. It also includes activities that those companies undertake in the United States. So if you're a partner with a Russian company that's investing into your operations here, OFAC administers that. And the OFAC is the office that promulgates the list of blocked persons, specially designated nationals, and applies the definitions of sectoral sectors. So there's a very useful online tool that OFAC has created. You see the web link there in your presentation. You have a copy of it. I recommend that you familiarize yourself with it. It's an easy way for you to do at least an initial search and get a sense of whether someone with whom you're dealing might be subject to one of the sanctions. At the Commerce Department, our role in sanctions enforcement is a bit more narrow. We're focused solely on the export side of it. Can you or can you not send a given product to a given end user or someone in a given sector in a given country? And so the unit of the Commerce Department called the Bureau of Industry and Security manages controls on exports of U.S. products and technology. And we have a representative from the Bureau, BIS, here in Minnesota, Perry Davis. He's here with us today, and he'll have a little bit more to say later. But we advise all of our companies who have questions about to whom they're selling to screen their customers against the consolidated export screening list. You have links there to a couple of tools that can help you do those searches. And finally, I've given you the main phone number for the BIS Outreach Division, where you can call and actually talk to a person and get additional information. So I strongly recommend that you reach out to OFAC and BIS with questions on sanctions, and definitely if you're a company, get yourself a very good legal counsel before you make business decisions. I'll mention my office in Washington, D.C., and also our department has small offices in Russia. we provide a number of counseling and services to American companies that are looking to expand their exports. Some of those, most of those services are free of charge. Some of the more value-added services we offer for a fee that we charge just to recover our costs for the taxpayers. We happy to give you advice on business obstacles. We're happy to give you our thoughts and help strategize with you a bit on your market entry plan or your market expansion plan. In the other direction, we're also very happy to be a channel for you to provide feedback and input into U.S. government policy. If you're encountering a trade barrier overseas and you want us to know about it, we're happy to take that information on board and see whether there's anything that we can do about it, either under one of the existing trade agreements or if there's a possibility of getting a new or existing trade agreement modified, renegotiated. My office, as Nikolai said, we don't just cover Russia. We cover the entire post-Soviet space. So if you've got business in Kazakhstan, Ukraine, or Turkmenistan, or wherever, anywhere in the former Soviet realm, we're happy to speak with you about that. I've left you our contact information. Lola Golomova and Rob Baker are our two desk officers that cover Russia. Feel free to get in touch with them directly or get in touch with me directly anytime. And then we do still have people on the ground in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Mike Lally is one of the sharpest folks we have in our entire government. And he's the right man in the right place at the right time. He heads up our office in Moscow. And then in St. Petersburg, Heather Burns, also a tremendous amount of experience in Russia. You're very welcome to reach out to their offices. We are having the difficulty that our office, along with all the other U.S. diplomatic offices, was forced to shrink because of the Russian government's decision that we had to cut the number of personnel. So we're down from 7 Americans down to 3 in Russia right now. But please, be a little bit patient, and we definitely will get back to you. Finally, I want to be sure and mention many of you know Ryan Connie. He's the director of our department's office here in Minneapolis, and that's if you don't know Ryan, you should. He and his office are great advocates for Minnesota businesses that want to do more business overseas. So I'll stop there and turn it over, but I'm happy to take any questions either during the Q&A period or to stick around later and during the break. So thanks.